5 divers descended into the waters off of Trinidad. They expected this to be a routine maintenance job, but within minutes, they were sucked into this pipeline and they were trapped in there, unable to breathe properly. What followed was a race against time, but as the men pounded on the walls of this pipe, the ones who could save them, the ones who were supposed to save them, were told to stand down. This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. Christopher Boodram squinted against the harsh Caribbean sun, shielding his eyes as he walked across the concrete platform. The water shimmered in the afternoon light, calm and deceptively serene. Beyond the glinting sea, tankers drifted along the horizon, the faint hum of machinery filling the air. It was a Friday, the 25th of February 2022, and this was just another routine day of industrial diving off the coast of Trinidad and Tobago. Christopher glanced at his watch. It was 2:30 p.m, and so it was time to gear up and go into the ocean. He was working for this company called LCMS Limited. I'm going to try and tell you this as succinctly and simply as possible, just in the way that I could understand it. There's a lot of documents, there's an inquest that's gone on, it's all quite complex, but all you really need to know was that this company that Christopher was working for was contracted by Pariah Fuel Trading Company. And their job that day was to repair this subsea pipeline. It was a pretty regular gig, they were used to it. You'd basically descend into this hyperbaric chamber, carry out the maintenance, and then resurface. Commercial saturation diving, especially in industrial settings like pipelines, is one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. What makes it so deadly isn't the kind of obvious risks you'd expect from being underwater, but it's a combination of things like extreme pressure, unpredictable physics, and the unforgiving nature of human physiology. So sure, this was dangerous work, but it was nothing that Christopher and the others hadn't done before. The team was small, but they were tight-knit and they knew exactly what they were doing. Kazim Ali Jr. was just 25 years old and he was the youngest of the team. He was actually son of LMCS's owner, and so he was really eager to kind of prove himself. Next was Faisal Kurban, a father of 2 with another on the way. His wife was actually 7 months pregnant at the time. Then there was Rishi Nagasar, reserved but steady and dependable, the kind of driver you would want by your side. And finally, Yusuf Henry, whose easy smile and calm demeanour made him a constant source of comfort during tense jobs. Christopher had worked with all of them before many times. They were friends, and underwater they were brothers. They were bound by the trust that only people who work together and risk their lives truly understand. The air that day was humid. There was sweat clinging to their backs, and they squeezed into these tight, heavy rubber diving suits. Their equipment was heavy. They had steel helmets, these cumbersome air tanks, and they also had these bulky gloves that they put on, but they were used to this. This was the job they knew how to do, and it paid well enough to support their families. None of these men had any idea that within minutes, their normal workday would spiral into a nightmare. It was 2:40 p.m. that the divers descended into this hyperbaric chamber. So from my understanding, this is like a kind of steel box that is secured over the riser. It creates this kind of pressurized environment that means that the men can work underwater. Once it's sealed, this chamber holds steady and it is set kind of at the correct pressure. It keeps the divers stable and protected. The work itself was really kind of tedious, but it was straightforward. And their voices crackled over the radio comms as they joked and kind of bantered together trying to pass the time. It was in this really small, humid space. It was cramped. They would have to move carefully, and you could hear their tools clinking against the steel. It was at 2:43 p.m. that another diver arrived. He swam down to the chamber, and he actually passed a wrench through the opening. And when they received that wrench, they were ready for the next step, which was deflating the plug. The plug is basically this barrier that keeps the riser sealed. It basically keeps the water out. And so at 2:45 p.m, one of the divers deflated the plug. In that one instant, everything went wrong. The moment the plug was released, the difference in pressure between the pipeline and the seawater triggered a delta P event. It's this violent and really sudden equalization of pressure. The best way I saw it described was it was kind of like the world's strongest Hoover or vacuum you can imagine, but underwater. It's like when you flush the toilet on an aeroplane. The seawater rushed into the pipe at a ferocious kind of speed, and it created this unstoppable suction force. It basically sucked everything in that steel box into the pipe. And I watched the actual GoPro footage of this happening. Kazim had been wearing this GoPro and it captures all of the moments up until this point. When that suction happens, the screen goes blank. It is just black and it happens in an instant, milliseconds. You actually can't comprehend how quickly this all happens. Christopher felt it before he saw it. 1 minute he was standing in this chamber, and the next he was snatched back with unimaginable force. It felt like he had been hit by a train. It was a kind of unrelenting force that ripped him off of his feet. Now, when he finally came to a stop, he could hear behind him, there were kind of the muffled screams of the other men. In this moment, they had all been dragged into the pipe. They were sucked nearly 50 feet through the pipeline before they came to it kind of looks like a bend in the pipe, and it's an air pocket. They were ejected into this air pocket, and that's where they kind of came to a stop. When they did come to a stop, they were lying on their backs in this pipe, and it was pitch black. I cannot emphasize just how dark this was. You wouldn't have been able to see anything, not even your hand in front of your face. They are literally at the bottom of the ocean. The oil and sediment in that area of the pipe was approximately 6 to 8 inches deep, and the diameter of this pipe was just 30 inches, so it is small. And they're lying vertically, so they can kind of breathe because there's this very small area where there's no water and no oil, so they're kind of breathing in that bit. The space was claustrophobic. It was just a few feet wide and it had these steel walls. It is also extremely cold in there. And so with every second that passes by, the men's strength is getting less and less. And at this point, Christopher knows his injuries are bad, but the other men's injuries are just as bad, if not worse. Christopher's heart pounded as he listened to the voices of the other men. He could hear them shouting, screaming, trying to figure out what had just happened. Now, the issue was, of course, they couldn't see anything, so they had to kind of communicate through just speaking. And they realised they had all come to a stop in around about the same place. And so they made this kind of human chain. They would link one person would link their legs over the next person's shoulders and so on and so forth. So they were in this kind of human chain, and it meant they could all move along together. The first issue that came up was they just didn't know which way they should go. Of course, it's pitch black. The pipe is like this and then goes up. One end leads to nothing. It is sealed off and then it's the ocean. The other end is where they came in through, so it's still got that hyperbaric chamber over it. Now, 3 of the men thought they should go this way. They thought they'd been sucked into the pipe head first. Christopher, however, thought they'd been sucked in foot first, and so they needed to go the other way. Now, because it was 3 against 1, he just decided to go with the majority, and so they all started to move that way. And I cannot stress how tedious and difficult and painful this was. They are moving centimetre by centimetre. And then one of the men came across something in his path. As he reached out, he kind of felt the thing and he realised it was an oxygen tank. It had been ripped through when they had been as well. And as he felt around, he found another. Christopher told the men they needed to pass the oxygen tube back and forth, taking big, deep breaths. At the moment, they were breathing in the fumes from the oil. It was making them feel dizzy, just really unwell and delirious. As they continued forwards, however, even just going those tiny amounts forward, the water started to rise. And the next part of the pipe they got to was completely submerged. Now, Christopher, we know, was injured, but the men in front of him were much worse off. 2 of them were struggling to breathe, and one of them thought that he'd suffered a broken leg. And so Christopher decides, well, he can't keep going that way, so he's going to turn and go back the other way and just hope that that is the way out. He made the brave decision to continue moving forwards that way. He said he would go and get help. And as Faisal was the next one along, so Christopher's here, Faisal's here, the 3 other men are here, as Faisal was closest to him, he also starts moving that way as well. But it wasn't long before Faisal told Christopher he just couldn't go on any further. Now, initially, I struggled to understand this. He knows that he has to keep going for the best chance of survival, but he says that he can't and has to stop. I couldn't wrap my head around this, but the more I started to think about it, the more research I did, I realised that this man is badly injured. He is terrified and he's exhausted. And his choices are either to stay put and hopefully wait for help, or continue forward and potentially drown or meet something even worse. He simply cannot muster up the strength to continue into the unknown and potentially be fully submerged in water and oil, and so he says he's going to wait for help. Now, Christopher did try and convince Faisal to come with him, but he said no, he just couldn't. Christopher assured him he was going to try and get out and he would send help back. And time went by slowly. Christopher was moving inch by inch. His body ached, he was bruised and battered from this vicious current inside the pipe. The pressure had been unbearable and the cold water had started to seep into his wetsuit, sending these shock waves of freezing cold water through to his limbs. And he's having to make this journey through fully submerged sections of the pipe. So he's taking these breaths from the oxygen tank that he's taken with him, just hoping that he'll have enough breath to keep going. And so now he gets to the part of the pipe that is like this, and now he's more upright. But to get to the top, he's going to have to swim this last bit. He's doing this with horrific injuries and absolutely no energy. And of course, we know he could get to the end and it's not the end he's hoping for. It could be the other end, the one that is sealed off. There is no help there. If that's the case, he's dead. Christopher eventually managed to reach the top, and that is when he saw a small slither of light. He lunged forward, slamming his fist against the side of the pipe. And at first, there was no response, no rescue team, no help. But he hit the pipe harder again this time. And then he heard the faintest echo. Someone had heard him. Someone was coming to help. A diver outside had heard the noise and knocked to kind of respond to Christopher. Christopher responded with more banging, and then the pipe was open and Christopher was saved. It was 4:25 p.m. when they managed to pull Christopher out to safety. His limbs were stiff and his body was swollen from the pressure. He could barely stand. His face was unrecognisable. But none of that mattered. He wasn't thinking about himself anymore. He was thinking about his friends, his brothers, he called them, under that water. His first words were a desperate plea. He told them that they were still alive. They were there, but they were trapped and needed desperate help. At 5:45 p.m, they attempted this first rescue, which is where they went in about 10 foot. Now, that was the absolute max that they were able to get to at this time with the equipment that they had. None of the men were there, but the diver that went down did manage to retrieve an oxygen tank. He brought this back to the surface, informed them that he couldn't locate any of the men and that they needed to come up with a different kind of plan to take them down further. This technique was rudimentary at best. Divers would be hooked up to this rope, plunged into the cold depths of the riser, and then they would have limited air supply to try and kind of just search for any sign of life. The method wasn't just inefficient, it was also incredibly dangerous. The tether meant that divers couldn't move freely and the air supply they had was just limited. It wasn't practical for deep, prolonged dives. And then it was at 7 p.m. that something happened that no one could have expected. Pariah Fuel, which is the company that I mentioned at the beginning, they were the ones who were supposed to be kind of coordinating this rescue. They stepped in with a chilling decision. It was a no dive order. No more human attempts to save the men below. This was despite, in the last hour, there had been a delivery of commercial equipment to help support this rescue mission. They'd had that equipment delivered, and that is when they said, actually, no, we are taking no more risks now. We are not going to let you dive. Basically, they were worried that there could be this Delta P event happen again. Delta P event is basically where the pressure changes and that suction force would happen. They were worried that that would kill anyone who was in the pipe. So instead, they said that they were going to send a robot in, kind of like just a camera, to go and inspect the pipeline to see what was going on. But this was devastating news for Christopher. It was as if the decision makers had forgotten that the lives of real men were at stake here. They were still there, still breathing, still holding on. But even so, that camera was deployed and it moved down the pipeline slowly, inspecting the area, sending back footage, and they could see debris and mangled wreckage in the pipe. And then at 8 p.m, more banging was heard. They didn't know exactly who it was, but to Christopher, this was a good sign. His friend or friends were alive, and they were able to be banging and alerting them of their presence. And the men are at risk of so many things here. There's obviously the injuries that they've already suffered. There's their limited air supply. There's the fact that they're literally submerged in oil and water. And on top of that, there is this decompression sickness. Now, when I first heard about that, I thought the word sickness, I didn't feel like it was that serious. I thought maybe they'd just get a little bit unwell, feel a little bit not so great, but, recover from it. But that's not true at all. Decompression sickness can kill you. It very much can be fatal unless you deal with it in the right way. And of course, these men have been sucked under at such a quick rate. They hadn't had time to do decompression stops on the way down, and now they had remained underwater for such a long period of time that was a real concern. And in the meantime, the footage from this camera that they'd sent down came back, and they saw that there was this scuba tank obstructing the pipeline. They said because of that, no one would be able to get through, and so they weren't going to be able to rescue the men. But we have since learned that the only thing obstructing that pipe was the oxygen tank, but we also know that Christopher managed to get past it during his escape, so it was possible. It's at 2:30 a.m. the next morning, so on the Saturday, that more bangs are heard on the pipe. So the men, or at least one of the men, is still alive. Equipment is used over the following few hours to try and get to the men, but they have no success. And then at 6 a.m, it's authorised that this very specific piece of equipment is going to be used to remove a part of the pipe. Nobody seemed to realise it at the time, but by doing that, it basically lowers the water level, and it means that pressure drops incredibly quickly. We already spoke about decompression sickness. And so this would mean that decompressing those 4 divers who had been confined to this pressure for hours and hours by this point, if they were still alive, that would have killed them. It wouldn't get to that point though, because it was 4 days later, so 4 days after the initial tragedy, that the men's bodies were pulled from the pipe. And of course, they were all dead. The official report states that the men died on the Saturday, but that's not 100%, and to be honest, there's conflicting reports of that. Even 2 reports that came from different coroners, but for the same body, said that actually they might have survived for 2 to 3 days before they actually succumbed to their injuries. They were stuck, they were trapped, and they were terrified. I just could not stop thinking about the fear of being trapped in this tiny pipe filled with oil, barely able to breathe, knowing that your time is running out. It is unimaginable. An inquiry was launched into the tragedy, and Christopher was called to talk about his experience. And the footage is heartbreaking. He is a broken man. He is fully deep in the pits of grief, and he's recounting what's happened to him and to these 4 men that he considered brothers. The reason this happened in the first place, and of course what the divers didn't know, was that about a month earlier the pipe had been cleared of all oil, and so differential pressure had been created. Pariah Fuel Trading Company, the very corporation that had sealed the men's fate, admitted they had no rescue plan. They claimed they had, quote, no legal responsibility to save the men. They had no obligation to send divers back down. And it gets worse. There were external rescue teams, volunteer divers who had skills, they had the courage to go down, and they were turned away. The families of the trapped men actually sat in the refinery car park for 4 days begging to help, but they were refused. And in fact, they were just at times begging for information, but were kept completely in the dark until the men were dead. It was in November of 2023 that the Commission of Inquiry made it clear this wasn't just negligence. This was criminal. The Commission said that the Pariah Fuels actions could be characterised as gross negligence, the kind of negligence that gets people killed. And they actually recommended that the company be charged with corporate manslaughter. It was in September of 2024 that charges were filed against both LMCS and Pariah Fuel Trading Company. But no matter how many charges were filed, no matter how many trials were held, it wasn't going to bring them back. In fact, the company's operations resumed the very next day. Faisal, Kazim, Rishi and Yusuf were left to die in the dark, abandoned by those who could have saved them. Thanks for joining me for today's episode of Red Rum, guys. It's something a little bit different. I'm finding that my regular episodes are super long at the minute. They're like 50 minutes, an hour long on the podcast. And as you can imagine, that takes a long time to not only write and edit, but also record, then also edit and splice together and put in podcast or YouTube form. So I wanted to do a slightly shorter one today. Even so, it's an incredibly tragic and important case. And it's actually one I hadn't heard of. I don't know where I've been, because when I started researching it, I realised there was a lot of information on it, but it is the stuff nightmares are made of. It's so great to be back, just to be here, be able to tell these stories, as horrific as they are, and bring awareness to them. If you're still here after a month or so of me not uploading new videos, thank you so much for being here. I am intending to get back to you with more when things calm down a little bit with work. Other than that, I'll see you soon for your next episode of Red Rum. Bye.